Chernobyl became one of the biggest disasters in the history of humankind, which changed our world forever. A sad reminder of the cost of a human error, it tells the story of brave people who sacrificed their lives in order to stop the invisible death. Unsurprisingly, this place on the map of Ukraine has always fueled people's imagination, serving as a source for some of the darkest fiction and movies that you can find out there. But today I'd like to share a story I've heard from my father, a liquidator who spent his 2 deployments in Chernobyl. As far as I know, this story hasn't been told yet, so I decided to dive into one of the myths surrounding the aftermath of Chernobyl disaster and try to understand whether it was a chilling fact or just another product of human imagination. My name is Operator Starsky, and this is the story of the wolf dogs of Chernobyl exclusion zone. In 1986, the city of Pripyat was full of life. Life that thrived around Chernobyl nuclear power plant located just several miles away. The plant provided citizens with everything necessary, like jobs, electricity, security, stability and wealth. Everything depended on this massive structure containing 4 nuclear reactors. Back in 1986, Pripyat was considered a city of future, until the tragic night of late April. Looking at the distant fires overwhelming the roof of the 4th reactor and the lights of fire truck rushing towards the plant, the sleepy citizens of Pripyat didn't even know yet that their world has been altered irreversibly. Only the next day, almost 35 hours after explosion, the Communist Party decided to declare evacuation of Pripyat and surrounding villages. 35 hours in the radioactive hell, which soon became known as the exclusion zone. Besides the city of Pripyat, approximately 100 settlements, mostly villages and smaller towns, were evacuated. In order to avoid panic among civilians, or maybe for a different reason, the Russian Communist Party informed people that they were only going away for 3 days. Therefore, the civilians were ordered to bring only the most necessary things like documents and provision. The villagers who kept cattle or hens were forced to leave their animals, and since everybody hoped to return in 3 days, they left them enough food and water. Some of them didn't even bother unleashing the pets. As a result, a lot of dogs eventually starved to death. However, some of them managed to survive and escape to the woods. A lot of the runaway animals died shortly after that for different reasons. There were groups organized to hunt stray animals and pets. There were still plenty of predators in the forests. Some of the animals couldn't find food without the help of humans. Overall, it was a tragic period not only for people but also for their abandoned animals. And this is something we should remember. The citizens were deluded by the communist Moscow, which generally is not surprising. Shortly after the disaster, the Soviets mobilized military personnel, which then got deployed to Chernobyl. The reason for that was that the Soviet soldiers were prepared and trained to operate in the contaminated environment in case of the nuclear war. Besides military personnel, different services were also involved: law enforcement, doctors, scientists, miners, and civil engineers. All those people later became known as liquidators. The tasks performed by the military included deactivation of the radioactive area, constructing a wall to separate the 30-kilometer exclusion zone, demolishing contaminated settlements, and not only that. The military were the first liquidators who climbed the roof of the nuclear power plant to clear it from the radioactive debris. It was the same roof where on the very first night of the disaster, the brave firefighters were losing their lives while trying to put out the fire. According to my father, some of their stuff was still there: equipment, gloves, fire hoses scattered across the roof. But one episode he often talked about was when he was given a Japanese dosimeter to measure the radiation on the roof. As he was climbing the stairs, the meter was showing increasing radiation, and when my father reached the doorway leading to the radioactive roof and shoved the meter outside, it just blinked and shut down. Downstairs, the Russian General Tarakanov was giving a motivational speech to the soldiers. When my father returned and reported about enormous level of radiation on the roof, the general told him, "It will be okay, the faster you do your job, the sooner you will go home." Then my father asked whether the young soldiers who had no children could be spared. General Tarakanov replied, "Are you communist or not, Lieutenant?" Despite all the Soviet propaganda, General Tarakanov never actually stepped on the roof. The soldiers, protected only with rubber aprons, had 60 seconds to grab whatever piece of debris they could find, throw it down from the roof, and quickly run back. Immediately below them, the burning nuclear inferno was spitting insane amount of gamma radiation, penetrating through concrete walls. All the makeshift protection the soldiers had on them was rather a psychological measure. It could not protect against anything. Shortly after that, my father and almost all of his company were hospitalized due to the acute radiation disease. Only several men survived to this day. Exclusion zone was a really dangerous place. The tiniest fragment accidentally brought to the camp in the folds of clothes or shoes could be extremely dangerous. Radiation absorbed by the human body would not kill instantly, but the damage was irreversible, which guaranteed slow and painful death within days. In such environment, where death was lurking in some of the most unexpected places, people would often encounter things they could hardly explain. Besides all the numerous tales about UFO sightings, mutants, and other conspiracist creepypasta, one particular story tells a tale of Chernobyl dogs, the same animals that escaped from the villages, avoided being shot by the hunting squads, and found shelter in the vast forests surrounding the area. According to liquidators, nobody could explain what exactly happened. Some of them assumed that domestic dogs mated with wolves, massively populating the area back in those days. As a result, a new dangerous breed was born, the wolf dogs. And this new breed had two particular features which made them extremely threatening. First of all, those who know a bit about wolves will tell you that these beautiful creatures are extremely cautious in the wild nature. In most cases, they will avoid any human contact. The reason they were so cautious and smart is the same reason they survived to this day. Unlike wild wolves, the new breed had absolutely no fear towards human. They weren't afraid of vehicles, lights, or fire, and could often be seen lurking just outside perimeter. Second feature was their increased ability to reproduce. According to people who tell this story, the wolf dogs could easily form packs of several hundred species that would roam the woods hunting every living being they could find, including man. In order to stop the plague of wolf dogs, the Soviets formed groups of hunters that were paid good money in order to eliminate the new species. The story doesn't tell how much time it took hunters to completely wipe out the population of the wolf dogs, but eventually they completely vanished and nobody heard of them ever after. Not until shortly before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when villages of Kiev, Chernihiv and Zhytomyr oblasts reported new disturbing finds. Domestic dogs were found slaughtered in the households in several villages. Cattle and hens were also attacked. The long-forgotten threat had returned. Or has it? One thing you should know about Chernobyl is that hundreds of biologists from around the world were studying the wildlife of the exclusion zone in order to learn how exactly contaminated environment influences the animals. One of the most shocking discoveries made in Chernobyl was that decades after the nuclear disaster, the wildlife thrived. Nowadays, in Pripyat itself, it's really hard to see buildings behind all the greenery. The trees grow on the Pripyat football stadium, turning it into a legit forest. The birds are nesting on the balconies, and wild boars often occupy first floors of the buildings, considering them a proper hideout. The absence of human resulted in exclusion zone currently turning into a legit reserve, with almost 70 kinds of rare species roaming the area. The Przewalski horse, the raccoon dog, the lynx, different species of bears and other creatures found themselves completely safe in some of the most dangerous areas on our planet. According to Professor Smith from Portsmouth University of the United Kingdom, the nature will thrive even after the most tragic nuclear disaster, and indeed it seems that nature always finds its way to survive. However, the radioactive pollution still cannot be ignored. Unfortunately, biologists keep documenting cases of living creatures being influenced by radiation in Chernobyl. Besides acute radiation sickness, a lot of species of the exclusion zone are suffering from related diseases. The studies showed that the most widespread pathologies in the wild animals that were exposed to radiation include decreased brain mass, also cataract, tumors, and low fertility. However, it's different across the wild species. For example, the Chernobyl area is a perfect landscape where you can find the species of worms resistant to the influence of radiation. Another shocking discovery was made after studying wolves in Chernobyl. American biologist Carol Love from Princeton University discovered that the wild wolves found in the exclusion zone developed genetic adaptation which helped them survive in the polluted areas. In particular, wolves of Chernobyl can absorb more than 11 millirentgen of radiation over their lifespan, which is 6 times higher than what is considered safe for human. But what about the wolf dogs? As of today, there were no documented cases of encountering such species in the area. Besides the fact that there's no proofs of them ever existing in the exclusion zone, I also found no evidence of those hunting squads organized by the Soviets. And according to biologists, even though mating between wolves and dogs is sometimes possible, but extremely rare. Additionally, researchers often catch different wild species on numerous cameras installed across the forests around Chernobyl. However, in decades there were no documented sightings of the mythical wolf dogs in the exclusion zone. The increased sightings of the wild wolves, on the other hand, registered in Kyiv, Zhytomyr and Chernihiv Oblasts, can be scientifically explained. The growing population of wolves in the exclusion zone requires new territory. Because wolves are smart creatures, they realize that it's much more efficient to find food in the settlements than hunting a bigger animal like deer or moose. Therefore, indeed, there were cases when the dogs were hunted and eaten. Also, in the night, the wolves would sometimes infiltrate the households and snatch cattle and hens from the farms. The local hunters would periodically ambush the predators, but in all known cases, they only encountered ordinary Ukrainian wolves. One thing I find truly fascinating, though, is that in Chernobyl you can still see plenty of animals that were once domesticated. For example, wild cows often sighted in the area of a household where their 91-year-old owner used to live, as well as the dogs, descendants of those domesticated animals that managed to survive until today. Looking at those creatures safely populating the exclusion zone, you can almost see the story unveiling before their eyes many generations ago. Story of tragedy, survival, and hope.